Hello, this is video lesson 4.2 and it begins on page 192. We talk about complex numbers and operations involving complex numbers. In lesson 4.1 we were introduced to the idea of complex numbers. Now we want a formal definition for it. A complex number is always going to be in the form of a plus bi, where a represents the real part and b represents the imaginary part. There we go, imaginary part. So whatever is the imaginary part is right next to I, and it doesn't include I. It's the number next to I, and a is going to be the real part that is not next to I. Alright, so if we take a look at a, example a, 9 plus 5i, the real part is 9, and the imaginary part is 5, which is right next to I. This part right there. Because both the real and imaginary parts of 9 plus 5i are non-zero, the number belongs only to the set of complex numbers. Okay. Now let's take a look at example B. Negative 7i. The real part of 7i, well, do we have an a here? Is there an a? It seems like we only have an imaginary part. Well, we can answer that. What is the imaginary part? It's going to be negative 7. It's right next to that I. But what about the imaginary part? We don't have one. So in this case, if you don't have an imaginary part or a real part, it's going to be 0. It works the other way as well. For example, we've been seeing numbers such as 4. 4 would be the real part, but what would be the imaginary part? Well, the imaginary part is going to be 0. Even though any number can have plus 0i, the reason we don't write 0i is because it's basically 0. And so every complex number has a real and imaginary part. So now let's go ahead and take a look at operations involving complex numbers. Adding complex numbers is very easy. You just combine like terms and get your final answer. What we need to pay attention to is when we are subtracting complex numbers. And really, when you're subtracting, you have a negative 1 right outside the parentheses. And what you want to do is you want to distribute this negative 1 to the inside of the parentheses. And so if we rewrite this, we have 18 plus 27i. Negative 1 times 2 is negative 2. Negative 1 times 3i is negative 3i. And so as you can see, we distributed the negative. Here we didn't have to distribute anything. It was basically a 1, which gives you the same answer. So now we can go ahead and combine like terms. We have 18 minus 2, which is 16. And we have 27i minus 3i, which is going to be 24i. And there you have it. That is going to be your final answer. 16 plus 24i. Notice we treated the I as if it were a variable. So if you have 27i minus 3i, you just subtract the coefficients. 27 minus 3 is 24, and you have that I at the end. Alright. Now remember from lesson 4.1, we learned that the square root of negative 1 is represented by I. I is just a symbol, just like pi is as well. Pi, well, that basically represents 3.14159 and so on. I is a symbol that you want to remember from now on. I is equal to the square root of -1. Now, what if I had I times I? And students were able to tell me that, well, that equals I squared. Yeah, correct. It is equal to I squared. But if we had I squared, what is that equal to in terms of the other side? Well, I times I, well, that would be I times, the square root of -1 times the square root of -1, which is equal to I squared. Well, what is the square root of -1 times the square root of -1? Well, that is the same thing as the square root of -1 squared, which is still I squared. And remember, when you have the square root, when you square a square root, they basically undo each other. And so whatever is left is going to be inside your square root, which is -1. And so -1 is equal to I squared. Notice that we found this by just using what we already know. But this is something that you want to remember as well. I squared is equal to -1. This is going to be important because we learned how to subtract complex numbers. Now we're going to learn how to multiply complex numbers. And notice we have two complex numbers in parentheses side by side. The operation is going to be multiplication. Now, how do you multiply complex numbers? What we need to do first is we need to take this 4 and distribute it to the other parentheses. And so 4 times 6 is going to be 24. And then you're going to take 4 times -2i, which is -8i. Now we're not done. We distributed the 4. Now what we want to do is distribute the 9i. So 9 times 6, that's going to be 54i. And then you want to multiply 9i times -2i. Well, 9 times -2 is -18. And now we have I times I, which is I squared. Okay. Okay, now we go ahead and combine like terms. Well, we can't combine 24 with anything, so it just stays the way it is. -8i plus 24i. Well, that's going to be 56i, 46i, I believe. And here we have -18i squared. What did we just figure out I squared is equal to? I squared is equal to -1. So instead I'm going to write -1 here. And since you have -18 times -1, well, that becomes positive 18 plus 24 plus 46i plus 18. And notice we can now combine 24 plus 18, and that's going to give me 8, 12, 46i, 42i, 42 plus 46i. Hope I'm doing the math correctly. 24. Yep. I just wanted to be sure. So the final answer is 42 plus 46i. There you go. So what we just did, we looked at how to subtract complex numbers and how to multiply complex numbers. And so that is the process. And at the end of the class, I had you do both of these. So this is added practice. Same thing, same process that we used to do this. to subtract complex numbers and multiply complex numbers. You're going to use that to do these two questions. Alright, thank you for watching.